Welcome back. We are back at it, the Bible's Big Story, and we've gone through the first 5 frames, and now we're going to move to page 5 in our booklet, and it's frame number 6, and it says the Exodus. And then I put in little quotes, the most important event of the Old Testament. Okay, this is the big thing. This is the Christmas, Good Friday, Easter story of the Old Testament. Okay, the salvation story. Now the dates I have on there, I probably would change that. I didn't notice that when I was doing editing this past week. Actually, just from recent stuff that I've learned, and I've learned from others, there's actually a pretty authentic date for the Exodus, probably 1446 BC. 1446 BC. All right, and that frame we're going to break down, but we're going to do so by kind of connecting it to the timeline. So we got frame 6, and then if you look at your timeline, the line that goes all the way through it, it ends up with that little symbol there, with the broken pyramid and the chains and God circling. That's our symbol for the Exodus, okay? Well, what I want to do is watch a little video clip first before we begin digesting some of the stories, okay? So again, Bible Project, this is such an important one, and they do a great job summarizing it very quickly and visually. We're going to take a look at.
Let's talk about the book of Exodus. Now, you're probably familiar with this book because of the epic story of Moses leading Israel out of slavery from Egypt.
Yeah, but that's just the first half of the book. And the second half has Moses giving the 10 Commandments to Israel, along with these blueprints for making a sacred tent. Now, right here in the middle is the story that connects these two halves together, and it all takes place at the foot of a famous mountain.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning.
So the first thing we have to remember is we're continuing the story from Genesis.
Yeah, in Genesis, God promised Abraham that through his family, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Genesis ends with Abraham's family down in Egypt. When Exodus begins, 400 years have passed, the family grows and becomes the people group now called Israel.
But there's this huge problem because the Israelites are enslaved to this king of the Egyptians, a guy called Pharaoh.
This guy is really bad news.
Yeah, he's horrible. He disregards their humanity, he brutally enslaves them, and he even orders that all of the Israelites' sons be killed by throwing them into the Nile River. He wants to wipe these people out. He's the worst character in the Bible so far.
Here's where we meet an Israelite woman who wants to save her son.
And so she does throw him in the river, but safely, in this little reed basket.
And Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby and takes him as her own.
This is the boy who grows up to become Moses, the man who will rescue Israel from slavery.
So Moses grows up, and one day, much later in his life, he has this crazy encounter with God where he comes across a bush that's on fire, but it isn't actually burning up.
God speaks from the bush, and he appoints Moses as the man he will use to deliver Israel.
So Moses goes to Pharaoh to tell him this news that God wants his people free.
And Pharaoh, he just pretty much laughs at him. He's like, who's this God Yahweh? And in fact, he's so offended by this request, he decides to make the Israelites work even harder.
So discouraged, Moses goes back to God and says, listen, this plan's not going to work.
But God repeats his promise that he's going to rescue them. And in fact, it's right here, for the first time in the Bible, that we hear the word redemption. It literally just means to purchase a slave's freedom. But God here uses this word to describe what he's going to do for enslaved Israel.
And God knows Pharaoh is going to resist, so he sends 10 different plagues, one after another, like turning water into blood, sending all sorts of pests and disease. These plagues are really severe.
They are severe, but we need to understand that the story is presenting these as acts of divine justice against one of the worst oppressors in the story of the Bible. And they're all aimed at the purpose of rescuing these enslaved people and defeating the gods of Egypt.
This all comes to a climax at the 10th plague, where God's going to kill the firstborn sons across all Egypt. Every house. It's pretty rough.
It is, but it's also God's response for how Pharaoh killed the Israelite sons.
Now as you turn the page, you suddenly get 2 long chapters of detailed instructions for what's essentially throwing a dinner party with a recipe for a lamb.
Yeah, but this lamb is super important. God tells the Israelites to pick it out and to prepare it to be eaten. And they're supposed to take its blood and then paint it all over the doorframe of their house. And anyone who is in that house will be spared from this final plague. And so this meal, which is called Passover, it commemorates this key moment in the story where God brings his justice on human evil, but also shows mercy by providing this substitute.
This final plague makes Pharaoh angry, and he demands that Israel gets out of Egypt, which is great. But suddenly, as they leave, Pharaoh changes his mind. He has a change of heart.
But on top of that, we're also told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart.
Why would God do that?
Well, what we need to remember is that over and over in this story, Pharaoh has already chosen to harden his own heart. So at this point, Pharaoh, he's not just evil, he's become monstrously evil. Even his own advisors think that he has gone way too far. And so how is God supposed to deal with such an extreme form of evil? And what we see in this story is that God uses his power to lure evil into its own destruction.
Pharaoh and his army are destroyed in the Red Sea as Israel passes into freedom.
And after this, we find the very first song of worship in the Bible, as people praise God for redeeming them. And it's in this story that the word salvation is also used for the first time, which means simply to be rescued from danger.
Now that they're saved, you would think that everything should be great. But the story quickly turns. The Israelites start wandering in the desert. They're tired, hungry, lost. And you start to wonder, what's God doing? What were they saved for?
And we learn the answer to that question in the very next story, which ties the two parts of this whole book together.
Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We think one of the best ways to understand the Bible is to look at the design and message of each individual.
Let's talk about the book of...
We do too. All right. So there is our graphic that we're going to digest. It's at the top of page 6 or top of page 5 of your worship, or your little booklet there, and it's on frame number 6 on your timeline. But we're going to break it down piece by piece. All right, just to introduce us, and we're going to look at some of the biblical passages that I got there printed on page 5. Okay, so again, our first image that we're going to look at is the descendants. You remember, what did they do? What were they doing before they met the Lord? Worshipping other gods. But here's what we're going to hear also from Ezekiel. Ezekiel's going to tell us even after they met the Lord, in Egypt, they still are worshiping those gods. In fact, Rachel, who was Jacob's fourth woman, his second wife, but fourth woman, when she left her father's house, Laban, she took with her his little statues, his little idols. And Jacob doesn't know that, but Rachel took them. And Laban accused him of it, and Rachel had to hide them in her baggage, and then she claimed to be having her period, so nobody could go and look for it. But she took them. And so even when they're in Egypt, they're still idolaters. Right? They're still not just worshiping the Lord. By the way, but we put fancier titles around it. We don't worship false gods, Packers. We don't worship false gods, fishing. We do! Anything we put our trust in above God is an idol. Our human hearts are always producing them. But so they're still worshiping gods, even in Egypt. So God's not saving them because they're faithful people. God's only saving them because of grace. So then, several centuries have passed, 400 years. The Pharaoh no longer remembers Joseph. He comes to power, and he enslaves the people. So we've got chains, right, around the land of Egypt. He enslaves them. He's trying to oppress them. Well, he is oppressing them, even to the point where he's going to try to put them to death. Okay? Then we've got another slide, another image. That's our symbol for what? God. There's our symbol for God. But notice the one arrow is extending from God down to specifically where? To Egypt. God is not distant. He's still their God. And he's coming down to do something for them. Okay? God's going to come down and rescue his people. He's going to intervene on their behalf. And he does that series of plagues, right? How many altogether? Do you remember? There was 10. 10 plagues. Yeah, 10 plagues. And every one of them, God's bringing justice against one of these gods of Egypt, right? That's really what's going behind them. So God's going to intervene and come down for the sake of his people. And the final plague is the Passover plague. Pharaoh sends the people out, But they come to the edge of the sea, and Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues them. And what does God do at the edge of the Red Sea? Parts the waters and fights for his people. The people safely pass through the water in certain depth, and they go to Mount Sinai. So we've got the waters divided, right? God, by the way, God is leading the people. They're not going on their own. God is leading them down to this mountain at Mount Sinai. And there we've got the pyramid, the mountain. We've got this little symbol of a tablet and clouds and lightning. And then we've got this circle of people and the tabernacle in the middle. Okay, that's what's going on with there. And there God makes a covenant with his people. And we're going to break down that one a little bit. And so the covenant is, they said that Exodus 19 chapters, the big one, yeah, it's the one that hinges the first part of the story to the second part of the story. Because, we're going to do a little video. We're going to talk more about that. So this is where we're going to end right now. This image right down here is this covenant. God's going to make another covenant. Who did he make the first covenant with? Abraham. And it was unconditional, no strings attached. This covenant is called the Mosaic covenant, but it is a conditional covenant. Different, okay? It is a different covenant. But before we get to that, we're going to digest it and hear a little bit more about that covenant from the second part of our Exodus. Yes, ma'am.
And that was actually the first Passover. I mean,
Yes, it was.
they had their feasts that they had at regular times.
No, not at all.
No, not at all. This was the first.
This was the first Passover,
Okay.
the first time, and then all those other festivals and feasts are prescribed in the book of Exodus.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, let's do this before we get to the video. Let's look at the first couple of the questions. So let's go to Exodus chapter 1. And I can't find it. Thank you. So this Bible is a really old Bible, and it's it's the only thing I have left of my mom's handwriting. So that's why I look at it right there. Happy birthday, Mark. Love and prayers. Mom and Dad, my 21st birthday. So that's really old Bible. And then so I've had it for a long time. It's, as you can see, it's worn out. Here's one funny story. When we were doing the dedication of our new building at Emmanuel, when I was in Wisconsin Rapids, I had it set, and it was so windy, this music stand blew over, and it blew, and that's where the binding broke. And I remember that because it was the day that we found out about Chris Redmond's death as well. So that was just a hard day for a lot of people, for us as well. So that's when my Bible broke apart that day. But we taped it back together. All right, so Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already there. Now Joseph and all of his brothers in that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful, and they multiplied greatly, became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Remember, what was the second part of the promise? You will become a great nation, many descendants. Well, that's already starting to happen, isn't it? Yeah. From 70 to who can count them all, right? Then a king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said, these Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly. Or they will become even more numerous. If war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against and leave our country. And so they put them to slavery. And it got so bad, verse 22, Pharaoh gave this order to all of his people. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Okay. So, from this image, this is describing right here the enslavement of the people. It got so bad, Pharaoh's even doing genocide, murdering all the boys of Israel. Okay? Because if you got no boys, you're not going to have any puppies being produced. Okay? All right. So, chapter 2. Skip down to the very last verses of chapter 2. Verses 23 through 25. Got it? During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery. They cried out their cry, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So in the midst of all of this suffering, this change, this oppression, where is God in the midst of all of it?
In the middle.
Right in the middle. He's there. He hears their cries. He sees their suffering. He remembers his promises, his covenant promises to Abraham, and he's concerned. God's going to do something about it. They may have said, God, you abandoned us. God said, no, I haven't. I'm here the whole time. I saw it all. I see it all. And I'm going to make good on my promise. Okay? So Exodus chapter 3. How is God going to do this? Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And then he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why this bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from the bush, within the bush, saying, Moses, Moses. Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. In other words, the God of the covenant, right? At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said to him, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cry coming before me because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of all those ites. And verse 9, And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. All right. So again, question with this one. What has God decided to do? And who does he call?
Calls on Moses.
Calls Moses.
Because he wants to let Pharaoh know that he's taking the people out of there.
So what has God decided to do?
Grace.
Grace. For because of grace, bring my people out. I'm going to rescue them. And notice the verb procession again, starting at verse 7. I've seen their misery. God's aware of it. He's not a God from a distance. I've heard their cries. And I remember and I'm concerned. So what does he do? Verse 8.
Rescues them.
Rescue them. I have come down to rescue. God's going to come down to rescue. He is not a distant God. He is a God who's going to be with them. And the dude he calls to do this delivery work? Moses. Who doesn't feel like, who am I?
Worthy.
I'm not, this isn't my job. Yeah. That's the way God operates. Chapter 6. So Moses goes. Pharaoh says, you got a lot of nerve asking me. I'm the most powerful king in the world. And you want me to give my slaves away? Let's make their work even harder. And so he makes their work even harder. And then Moses goes and complains to God. In chapter 6, God responds. And he just repeats some stuff. And then when we get to verse 6, I'm going to stop. Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. Is he doing this because the people have been so faithful?
No.
He's doing it because of his grace. God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, as God Almighty. But my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land where they lived as aliens. And moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom I whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. So that's all just God reminding them, I'm the promise keeper, God. This is going to happen. Now, this is the new promise he makes, verse 6. And I want you to just note how many I wills are there. The I will do these things. Therefore, the Lord said, therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. And I will, and they made mention of this, this is the first time the word redeem is used in the Bible. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people. I will be your God, and then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to the land that I swore with an uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Did you catch how many I wills there are? 6. There might be 7. There's a lot. God's unilaterally going to do this because they've been faithful? No. He's saving them because of who he is. And he knows that this family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, they've got a mission. What's their mission? To save the nations, to be a blessing for all the other nations of the world. So God's got to make good on his promises, and he's got a purpose for that. Okay? Then we know the story of the Exodus, or the plagues. We're going to skip over those. Go to chapter 12. So the last plague that will break Pharaoh is the plague of the firstborn. God's going to bring justice, right? Because what has Pharaoh been doing to all the Israelite baby boys? Killing them. God's justice is, I'm going to strike down all the firstborn of animals and people in all of Egypt as justice. Pharaoh's going to know my justice. But he also offers mercy with that justice. Because if anybody would take a lamb, sacrifice it, put its blood on the door frame, God would do what when he saw that house? Pass over and spare them from that justice. That's mercy. So, they celebrated, they do it just like God says, verse 12, on that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you. And when I strike down Egypt. Now skip down to verse 29. This is God saying he's going to do it. In verse 29, this is when God did it. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, the firstborn of the livestock as well. And Pharaoh and all of his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night. There was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks, your herds, as you have said. Go, and also bless me. And so what's the result? What happened as a result of God's victory? They've been freed. Yeah, they've been freed. They've been redeemed. Brought back. Right? Slaves brought back. All right? And so they march, they leave with everything that they have. They get to the edge of the Red Sea. And I'm not going to read that. That's too long of a section for this. But you guys can see a little bit of it. What I want to do is start at verse 10. Chapter 14, verse 10. Now, as Pharaoh approached the Israelites, they looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching on them. So they got a professional warrior chariots, an army marching on them, and they're just refugees, right? They're former slaves, and now they're just refugees. And they were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the desert? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, Leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to have served the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses answered the people, Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still. And then how is that? We know what happens then, right? God divides the waters. That's depicted where in this scene?
You can see it comes from the Red Sea.
Yeah, the waters that have been divided there. And this is Easter. This is, by the way, this will be our Easter story this year from Exodus 15. Because when a professional army is marching on you as refugees, that's certain what?
Certain death.
Certain death. But God saves them from certain death and brings them to life by destroying death itself. Because not only does God provide a way for them to pass through the waters, he destroys the enemy that pursues them. Death is destroyed. That's Easter right there. So this is Christmas, right? Christmas, God coming down, fighting for his people, rescuing them. That's Good Friday, right? The Passover lamb, sacrificing his blood to the Easter promise of the waters divided and life given to them. That's the salvation story. Whenever you're an Israelite growing up, and you would say what we would call a creed, that's what they would say. We were a wandering people. God rescued us and brought us through the Red Sea. So an Orthodox Israelite, even today now, would say, well, how many people passed through the Red Sea? We all did. How many of us were saved at the Passover? We all were. Right? That's their story of salvation. That's our story of salvation as well. Because we're not ethnically related to the descendants of Abraham by faith. We are the descendants of Abraham. Any questions? Yes, Jack.
Now Moses grew up with the princes under the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
When do they think he learned about the God of Israel? He was.
Well, if you remember
when he married and worked for Laban.
He didn't work for Laban. You mean Moses?
Yeah.
He finds out when he sees a fellow Hebrew being killed. Now, if you remember the Ten Commandments movie, the daughter fesses up. So there's somewhere he realizes he's not truly a biological Egyptian. He's part of these Hebrew people. Yeah. It's somewhere there in chapter 2.
And then by feeling like, because I am one of them, I should live with them.
Well, he
Goes
actually,
to live with them,
what happens is, he leaves. What happens is he sees a Hebrew person being brutalized by a slave master,
Yes.
and he kills that
That's
slave
it.
master.
Yeah. And then he
And
flees.
somebody sees it, and it's going to squeal on him, and so he flees. Yeah, he flees to Jethro the Midian, who he's not a Hebrew, he's a Midianite. And there he meets his wife and marries his wife. And
So, but John's asking, right, when does he know about God? When is it just by seeing God?
when the bush calls him.
Okay, so it's at that point.
Yeah. And I got a bad joke about that some of you have heard, so I won't tell that again. All right. It's not bad as in it's naughty. It's just bad as in it's a bad.
It's a dad joke.
Yeah, it's a dead joke. Okay. Other questions? All right. Let's keep moving. We're going to take a look at this video. That's going to introduce us to the second part of Exodus and the making of the covenant.
The first half of the book of Exodus tells the story of ancient Israel being rescued from slavery. And when people say the Exodus story, those are the chapters they're referring to.
But the book has a second half where Moses gives the 10 Commandments to Israel along with these instructions about building a sacred tent.
And what links these two apps together is this crucial story. The people of Israel, they're out in the middle of nowhere. They find themselves at the foot of this mountain called Sinai. And here, God's presence comes dramatically down in the form of a violent storm cloud.
Now let's stop a second and talk about this concept of God's presence, because it's really important for the rest of the book. At the beginning of the Bible, in the Garden of Eden, humanity was in God's presence. They had this close relationship with him, and it was good. But humanity rebels, and the relationship is fractured, and access to God's presence is lost. But God promised Abraham that he would restore his blessing to all of the nations, and that includes this restoration of relationship and access to God's presence.
So here at Sinai, God's presence is now right here in front of them, and it's actually quite frightening. And he's here to invite Israel into this unique and close relationship with him.
And the word used to describe this relationship is covenant. It's like a legal agreement between God and Israel. And it's unique because up till now, God hasn't asked Israel to do anything in return, just to trust him. But here on this mountain, God is going to ask Israel to do something. a lot of things, actually. He gives them a whole set of laws. It includes the 10 Commandments. And if they obey these commandments, they will become the people who will represent God to the nations of the world.
Like a priest would.
Yeah, in fact, that's what God calls them to become, a kingdom of priests. And this is all connected back to the promise to Abraham that his family would become a blessing to the nations.
Okay, but obeying these laws is going to be difficult because there's a lot of them and they set a really high standard.
Though if you think about it, I mean, of anybody in the world who should be able to do it, I mean, it's these people who experienced firsthand God's grace and his power when he rescued them from slavery.
And they agree to obey the terms. But then they refuse to go into God's presence because it's still a bit frightening.
And since the people won't go up, Moses goes up to the mountain by himself to meet with God. But God still wants to be with all of his people. And so he says, okay, if the people won't come up here to me, I'll come down off this mountain to be with you all. And that's why he orders Moses to build this elaborate tent as a place where God's presence can be among his people.
And that's why the next thing we get is 7 chapters of extremely detailed architectural blueprints for this tent. It's really, really, really long.
But every detail is important and has some kind of symbolic value. For example, there's all of this Garden of Eden imagery inside the tent. And it's to remind you that when you're in the tent, you are in God's presence.
Then we get another 6 chapters describing how they built the tent, which is really just repeating the same blueprints word for word.
Now let's back up, because before the tent is finished, there's this super important story. Moses is coming off the mountain with the 10 Commandments and the blueprints in his hands, and he finds Israel breaking the first 2 commands of the covenant.
Don't have any other gods before me, and don't worship idol statues.
Right, and so here we are, immediately after agreeing to the covenant, they're throwing this ritual party, they're worshiping an idol. And so God says to Moses, you know what, this is not going to work. I should just wipe these people out and start over with you.
But Moses reminds God of his promise to Abraham and pleads with God to spare them, which is a really weird conversation. Why would God need to be reminded of something?
Yeah, it does seem odd, but this dialogue is inviting us into God's experience of grief and pain due to Israel's actions. And he really could walk away. But instead, this God chooses faithfulness to his own promises, even though he knows it's going to cost him.
So we come to the end of the book. The tabernacle's built, God's presence comes down off the mountain to fill it, and in the final scene, Moses goes to enter the tabernacle to be in God's presence.
But he can't. He's actually not able to go inside, and that's how the book ends.
Why can't he go in? That was the whole point.
So when Israel worshipped the golden calf, it was like a slap in the face to God's faithfulness. And so Moses can't just waltz into the tent like everything's just fine. There's a deeper problem still in this relationship.
Will they ever be able to fix the relationship and go into God's presence?
Well, that's what the next book, Leviticus, is all about.
Hey, this is John. And this is Tim. We believe the Bible is one long story.
The first half.
All right, so now we're going to narrow in on that picture, okay? And it's not, I don't have that picture on your booklet, but it's there in the bigger frame. But we're going to narrow it in on it, okay? And we're going to talk about what each of those elements means. And we're going to start with this one. God makes a covenant with them, okay? Now, the covenant isn't necessarily just 10 Commandments. It's actually much bigger than that. His presence is there. They talk about that too. Cloud and flashes of lightning, God's presence. When did Adam and Eve experience God's presence in original creation? In the garden. Yeah, God would come and walk with them. But once they sinned, that relationship's broken, right? But God would keep showing up. And this is the thing. He wants to be with us. Okay? But the people are afraid. So Moses goes by himself and makes this covenant. So here's this covenant. Now, this is at the top of page 6. Okay, we're going to walk through this just really quickly, but it's important to see it. The top of page 6. God makes this covenant with Israel. And here's what we mean by covenant. That tablet has 6 parts to it. Okay? And this matches, again, what would have happened in the ancient world. They call archaeologists about 150 years ago found all these tablets in modern-day Turkey, which was part of the biblical worldview. They called it the Surzumri Hittite Treaty Covenants. So where a powerful king defeats the less powerful king, he wants to make a covenant with him this is how our relationship's going to work. I'm the powerful one. I've defeated you. Now you will be subject to me. And here's what they did. They would start with a preamble. I am King Mark, and I defeated you, King John, right? And with an outstretched arm, I defeated you. So they would give the prologue. Okay? And then I would say, here's the stipulations. Oh, King John, every year you will bring tribute to me and my kingdom, 1,000 sheep and 500 camels, and you'll do that every year and bring your tribute to me. And you'll live under my rule. And you agree to do that because we've made witness. We're going to preserve. We're going to make a yearly anniversary of this. Every year on the victory date of my conquering you, you're going to come and bring this tribute. And I'm going to remind you about the covenant that we just made here with each other. And I'm going to start off by saying, I am King Mark, who defeated you, King John. You promised to do this. And we'll just remind ourselves of it every year. Then we've got our witnesses. For me, it's my court, right? They're going to be witnesses that you agreed to this and I agreed to this. And then finally, the sixth part of it would be the blessings and the curses. If you do this, you'll be blessed. If you don't, there'll be consequences. There'll be curses. Okay? So God understands that the people know this pattern of developing relationships, of covenant relationships. So that's exactly what he does in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy and the like. So take a look at Exodus chapter 20. So this is after they've come out of the land, after they've passed through the waters. They've come to the mountain, chapter 19. There, God's presence comes in the lightning and the cloud, and God wants to be with his people. They're freaked out. No, it's too much. Moses, you go. And Moses says, I'll go. And the people, God says, no, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make a covenant. So look at verses 1 and 2. God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God. That's the preamble. God introducing himself. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's the historical prologue. God introduces himself. I am the Lord your God. Prologue. I've done something. With an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, I brought you out of Egypt. Okay? That defines who God is and what he's done. And then starting in verse 3, what do we hear? You shall have no other gods before me. What is that? First commandment. And then it goes on for 10 more in the book of Exodus, at least chapter 20. But then you know how many more there are? 603 more. Talk about memory work, huh, Candace? 613 altogether in the books of Moses. Okay? The stipulations. This is how you are to live. This is how you are to behave in this relationship, designed for your good. Not designed so that I'll love you, because God already loved them. Yeah, they don't even have the commandments yet, and God saved them. So the commandments were designed for this is how we live out our life together. The preservation and the rereading. So we're not going to look at it, but it's in Acts, I got the witnesses next on our list. I got the number wrong on my sheet to that. So the witnesses, okay, who are the witnesses? Just quick turn to Deuteronomy 30. Keep your page there in Exodus and turn to Deuteronomy. Just a couple books later. Here are the witnesses. Chapter 30, verse 19. Are you there?
Mm-hmm.
What is it, Jonathan?
Chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, verse 19. God says, this day actually this is Moses speaking. This day I call on heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land that he swore to give to his fathers, your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Who are the witnesses? Heaven and earth, creation itself. And he repeats that again in chapter 31. And then, by the way, we had this a couple of weeks ago in our Advent series on Micah. Micah chapter 6, when God has a case against his people, he says, and I've got a case against you. You haven't followed what I told you to do. And who are the witnesses in this case? God said, the heavens and the earth are my witnesses. They'll testify against you. You as my people haven't done what you agreed to do. And so there are witnesses. The preservation and the rereading, that actually gets done in Joshua 24. When Joshua has that line, maybe you've got a plaque or had a plaque in your house, as for me and my household, that is a part of his rehearsing and recovenanting, rehearsing and telling each other of the story. Joshua 24, he just says, this is what God has done for us. This is what God is for us, and we agreed to it. You can choose for this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we'll serve the Lord. And then the blessings and the curses. So stay in Deuteronomy, chapter 28. Now this whole covenant, Sinai covenant, is going to come back into play when we look at the prophets, okay? That's why we're spending a little bit of time on it. So chapter 28, starting at verse 1. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And verse 2, all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey, if you listen to the voice of the Lord your God. You'll be blessed. Okay? You'll be my people, and you'll be blessed. Okay? If you follow it, you'll be blessed. Doesn't mean you're saved. You've already been saved, right? You've been saved by grace through faith in God. This is just a blessing. These are the consequences of living in the pattern that God has for you. You'll be blessed. Okay? And that goes through verse 14, where he ends with it, do not turn aside from any of these commands I give you today, to the right, to the left, following other gods and serving them. Don't do that. And then verse 15, he introduces the curses for disobedience. And that goes through chapters 28 and 29. And the curses basically are summarized if you go down, look at verse 36, chapter 28, verse 36. This is the essence of the curse. If you go after other gods and you become unrepentant idolaters, it doesn't mean if you sin, they'll always be sinners, saved by grace. But if you turn and forsake God, the Lord, verse 36, the Lord will drive you and the king you set over you to a nation unknown to you and your fathers, and you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone. And you'll become a thing of horror and an object of scorn and ridicule to all the nations where the Lord will drive you. So God says, you'll lose the land. You do this, and the curses is you're taken from the land, and other kings are going to rule over it. Okay? The blessings and the curses. But God will remember his promises, right? Because the covenant. We'll get back to that. All right. So we spent a little more time than I probably should have on that one, but that's okay. So now you look at this image. They go down to this mountain. God's presence is there, makes the covenant, and then they talked a lot about that tent that God makes. Fancy word for that is tabernacle, the tent of meeting. What was the purpose of that tent?
God's presence.
God's presence. This presence that seemed to have abandoned his people. No, God wants to be with his people. And so he says, I'm going to tent among you. I'm going to tabernacle among you. What were they living in? Tents, yeah. And so God's tenting among them. And so we've got this circle of people, the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant is housed in there. This portable shrine, because they're moving around all the time, you can't build a permanent building. But then these little dots around that are the people who have encamped.
So they had the Ark of the Covenant with them in Egypt, and so when they left,
they have it now. Well, it gets built with the Ark of the Covenant gets built with the tabernacle.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's part of that.
All that instruction.
Yes, all that instruction is design. And the whole purpose of the tabernacle, the tent, is to know what?
God's with them.
God is with them. His presence.
His cloud
and his cloud fills it, and that's his presence. Now, think about what we just celebrated a couple weeks ago at Christmas time. The Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Bad translation. It's an English word. The literal word means he tabernacled among us. The word is the Greek word for setting up a tent, tent camping. He tabernacled among us. What do you think John's trying to tell us? There's God's presence. You look at Jesus and there's God's presence among you. He hasn't left. He's still there. He has tabernacled among us, and we have seen his grace we have seen his glory full of grace and truth. Jesus will become the fulfillment of that. God's presence among us, his people. All in that covenant promise. And there the commandments are given. This is how you're designed to live. Not to be saved. Already been saved. Therefore, this is how you live. Because you have been saved. All right. Now, let me see. Let's look at chapter 40 of Exodus. I'm going to look at that last question, the bottom of page 5. And we already read the Exodus 20. That describes the covenant. Exodus 19 was the mountain. Exodus 14 tells us finally the purpose of this tabernacle. And Peg's already hinted to it. Chapter 40, verse 34, the last 4 verses of Exodus. Are y'all there? Peg, you want to read those?
Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels.
So whenever you camped out and you saw that tent of meeting, a cloud over it during the day, fire at night, you knew what?
God was with them.
God is with you. When it moved, you moved. Because you wanted to be in God's presence and camped around him. And Jesus becomes the walking fulfillment of that tabernacle. He is God's presence now among us. All right, so back to page 6 on our little booklet. And let's just talk about those discussion questions really quick. Did God rescue the people from Egypt because they were faithful to him?
No.
Joshua and Ezekiel reminded us that they were idol worshippers. Right? Even in the land of Egypt, before they were rescued, they worshipped other gods. And that's what they will struggle with, and that's what we struggle with. Okay? So God doesn't save us because we're faithful. Did God rescue the people from Egypt because they were earnestly trying to keep his commandments?
No.
Because why?
Because of his grace.
Because of grace, he saved them.
Yeah.
And he hadn't even given them commandments yet. They don't even have the 10 commandments yet. What does the biblical record then say about how the people traveled, how they behaved during their time in the wilderness? Well, let's take a look at that. Numbers chapter 11. So you think that these people who were first-hand witnesses of all these incredible things that God has done, you think that, that would be enough for us, right? Well, it's Numbers, just past right before Deuteronomy. God is taking care of them every step of the way. They saw him with the plagues. They saw him with coming through the waters. When they get hungry in the desert, God's made food appear at night and birds at the day. When they get thirsty, they strike the rock and the water comes from them. And they've seen God do all these things. So how are they going to behave? Let's see. Now the people complained about their hardship in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger aroused. The fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. And so the place was called Taberah, because fire from the Lord had burned among them. And the rabble among them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing, saying, "If we only had meat to eat! We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt at no cost, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now we've lost our appetite. Now all we have is this stinking manna." Does that sound familiar? The manna was like coriander seed and looked like resin. The people went around gathering it, and they ground it and crushed it into mortar. They cooked it in pots and made them into cakes, and it tasted something like made with olive oil. When the dew settled at night, and manna came down. Moses heard the people, every family wailing, each at his entrance of his tent, and the Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. So this is their 40 years, right? They do nothing but what? Grumble and mutter and complain. What have you done for me lately, God?
And it was a problem for them because he would only provide a day's worth, right?
Well, and they got sick of just the manna,
Yeah.
right?
But
Manna
they
burgers, there's only so much you can do with manna.
You always had to worry about tomorrow.
And so they want to go back to Egypt because everything was great there. Well, hello, you were enslaved, your babies were being thrown into the river. You want to go back to Egypt. All right. So, that's the story of the Exodus. How long do they wander? 40 years. Till they finally come to the east bank of the Jordan River. And there God again divides the waters. And they go into the land of Canaan as they pass through the Jordan River to the other side. And that's the story of the Exodus. This is the big story of their salvation. This is what they will always come back to. Right? This is our story of salvation. Like I said, this is going to be our Lenten theme,
Well,
the story of the Exodus.
And I
Yes.
think exactly that's kind of the problem I have. I don't want to say we have, I have, is that we think this was their problem.
Right.
This was Israel doing this. This was the Jews. This was their problem. But that's all of us,
That's all
not
of us.
just them.
Peg, thank you, because there it is.
Oh.
So this is the Exodus story. This is our personal Exodus story. This is our journey. So we've got our image for what?
God.
And we've got chains. Chains. And then what is that circle turned in on itself, that arrow turned on itself?
That we're only thinking of ourselves.
Sin, right?
Yeah.
Turned in on ourselves. So we are slaves to,
Sin.
okay? This is what? The
Death.
consequence of sin? Death.
Death.
And the power of the devil, the satanic, right? These are the things that we are enslaved by, right? We're no different. We're enslaved by the same things, right? So God is going to come down. The person is right, come down. He fights the fight that we cannot fight. He rescues us from our slavery to sin, death, and the devil. He redeems us with the purchase of our lives, not with silver or gold, but with his own precious blood and son's death. And then, do we pass through death and life? What's that drop of water in this symbol? What do you think that is? Baptism. The Holy Spirit, right? And our baptismal waters. If you've been joined to Jesus, you've been joined to a death like his. And if you've been joined to a death like his, you've been joined to a resurrection like his. And that you've passed through death and life through the waters, just like they passed through the waters. So have we. And then, what did God do with them down here? Made a covenant. Tabernacling among them, making a covenant. So we've got King Jesus, right? And he's in the servant form. He washed people's feet on the night of his betrayal. And he says, I give you a new commandment. Here's the new covenant life you are to live. Just one. Not 613. One. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, all the world will know you are my disciples. And do we have the presence of Jesus among us?
Yes.
He is the glory of God. In his presence, he is among us. We're never alone. I will be with you always to the end of the age. This is my body. This is my blood. I'm with you always, now and forever. And I make a covenant with you. Do we wander in the wilderness? This isn't our final place. This is not our final destination. Right? God has a new heavens and a new earth for us. He's going to restore things, but we wander. And in the midst of our wandering as pilgrims in this wilderness, does he sustain us like he did them? Bread and cup. Right? My presence will sustain you. He'll provide for us. Then he leads us, and he transforms death into the gate, where we pass over one more time the water into the promised land. Right? Through the death and the resurrection of Jesus, death will not be the end. He's opened to us a gate to the everlasting life. to the new earth that we will live on with resurrected bodies. That's our story. That's our journey. It's just a repeat of what God did in the story of the Exodus. All right, that one's a little added one to this, to the timeline of the Bible. Oops. Did you freeze? Oh no! I gotta go to. They got too big. I gotta go to a different
File?
Yeah, the file got too big. So that's why it buzzed out there. I had to send it over in 3 separate ones from my old computer. Because it was just too big. Alright. We okay? Does anybody need a break? Want to keep plugging along a little bit? Alright. Because I don't want to be known as the guy who didn't give breaks. Alright, page 6. Frames 7 and 8. Partially fulfilling the Abraham covenant. This should probably say partially fulfilling. So what were the 3 points of the Abraham covenant again? I will give you the
Land.
I will make you
Fruitful.
great nation, and you will be a blessing for all the lands. So have they become more numerous now? Yes. Yeah. They still aren't in the land though, right? They've been wandering in Egypt for 400 years and now wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But God is going to make good on his promise. He kept telling them, I'm going to bring you to that land. And so that frame number 7 is Joshua leading the Israelites to the conquest of the land. So let's just talk about that slide and some of the meanings there to begin with. First of all, we've got this dude right here. That's Joshua. What's Joshua doing? Blowing the horn. In the Hebrew, it's called the shofar, the ram's horn. And when the shofar is being blown, this is a call to what? To arms, to war, right, to a conquest. And so Joshua, first 5 chapters, making preparations. Then it talks about the conquest. And then it talks about dividing the land. That's kind of how the book of Joshua is divided. And by the way, though it's the next book in the Bible, Deuteronomy, Joshua, the first 5 books are Moses' books, right? The Torah. Starting with Joshua now are the prophets. Joshua was considered a prophet. It's historical in nature, but it's in the Bible, it's considered a prophetic book. It's interpreting the things that have happened in history through a theological lens. This is what God is seeing happening and what God is doing. Okay? So first of all, we've got this guy with the shofar, and then we've got this. You know what that little symbol is with the box and the angels pointing towards one another?
That's the tabernacle.
Well, not the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant, yeah. So in the very middle of the Ark, in the middle of the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holy Places, was the Ark of the Covenant. And in it contained the tablets, some of the manna, the bread, and some of the scrolls, okay, the written words, okay. And it was where the priest would go once a year on the Day of Atonement. He would go with the blood of the animal that was sacrificed for the sins of the people for that year, and he would sprinkle it. And they called that, the image, right, this lid was called the mercy seat. And he would sprinkle it on that as atonement for the people's sins, because that Ark of the Covenant, this is where God's presence is. It's not God, but it's where his presence is. It's his seat of mercy. And that's where they would sprinkle the blood for the atonement for the people's sins. So, embedded in that ark is this what?
Dagger.
A dagger, a sword, right? So there's going to be a battle going on, a conquest. Because there are people that live in this land, but God has promised it for his people so that they could be a blessing for the people. But they have to have a place to go. So the story is that God is the one who's going to lead this. Joshua is the general, but who's the real general? God, the Lord is. So that's kind of what's going on. And then this is the land that God promised them. And they come and they pass right through here, through the river, and then slowly begin to take over the land. East bank, west bank. So when you hear today in the news, the west bank, that's this side of the Jordan River. That's what they mean, this land right here. But at one time, possessed by the Israelites. But if you don't keep the covenant, what did God say happens? You get cut off from the land. So this is where they come to possess the land. And Joshua is telling the story of God being the leader throughout it. So that's kind of what the image is. And, oops, I went there. So now let's look at some of the Bible texts that I got printed here. So, bottom of page 6, let's look at Joshua chapter 3. So, Moses has died. Moses dies somewhere over here on the east side. Okay? He's not allowed to go into the land because he got a little haughty at one time to God, and God says, you're not going either. But from Mount Pisgah, he could see what it looked like. So if you ever see a church named Mount Pisgah, there's a few of them, not a lot. It's kind of the image of, this is Moses' view of the Promised Land. So it's a neat name for a church. From this church, we're seeing the Promised Land. But that's where Moses dies. He's not going, but his lieutenant, Joshua, becomes the new leader. And so God's made a lot of promises. The first couple chapters of Joshua is God making promises to Joshua. It's hard to replace a guy like Moses, I get it, but I'm going to be with you. And by the way, it's my show anyway. So that's what this is going to happen. So chapter 3 of Joshua. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim, and they went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the Ark of the Covenant, remember that's the symbol of God's presence, right? Leading them, of the Lord your God, and the priests who are the Levites carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. And then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 1,000 yards between you and the ark, and do not go near it. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves to the Lord, for the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it, and they went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of Israel, that you may know that I am with you, as I was with Moses. And tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. So, who's really leading these people? Joshua is the under general, but God's the real leader. As long as God's the leader and you're following, what? Sounds good. Thumbs up. That's the way it should be. That's not the way it always will be, because we don't always follow. So chapter 6, let's look at that too now. They come to the first big city-state when they cross the river, and the big city-state is called Jericho. And it's a fortified city, right? They've already kind of spied it out a little bit in chapter 2. And the people of Jericho think they're all fine because they live in this fortified city and they've got new people, Israelites, coming after them. But what are they going to do? Well, God's going to show, I got a plan. You would think that if Joshua was in charge, he would say, we're going to ram down the walls, we're going to break through the city. God says, no. You don't need to do that, right? The old battle of Joshua and Jericho is that we're going to do it my way, God says. So let's take a look. I'm going to start at verse 6. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, take up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the people advance, march around the city with the armed guard, going ahead of the Ark of the Lord. And when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the Ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. And they did this because God told them to do it. And it doesn't sound like a great battle plan, but what happens? The walls come tumbling down. Josh fought the battle of Jericho. Jericho, you don't know Jericho. And the walls came tumbling down, 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 shooby-dooby down, shooby down, shooby down. Right? Doesn't sound like a great battle plan, but who's in charge of this battle plan? And that's an example of it. Okay? God's in charge. And when he's charged and leading it, it goes well. But let's hear about Joshua. What's his role in this whole story? Well, go back to Joshua chapter 1. Verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people are getting ready to cross the Jordan River into the land that I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where your foot set, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert of Lebanon, from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Great Sea on the west. By the way, when the Palestinian protesters are going from the river to the sea, this is their reference. This is what they mean. From the river Euphrates up here to the sea. That they want to overtake all this land because that's the land that God promised these Israelites. Okay? Well, the point is, New Testament-wise, is it's not about the land anymore. It's not about the land. It's about the promises of the new heaven and the new earth. Whoop, what just happened? I must have done something wrong. Right up. Okay. Oh, one, two. Okay. So, where were we? Verse 5. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land that I swore to your forefathers to give them. Be strong and courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let the book of the law, the covenant, depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. And then you will be prosperous and successful. For have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So how would you describe Joshua's whole role in all of this work?
Follow God.
Follow God. That's a great description. Follow the leader. And the leader is the Lord. You aren't the leader, Joshua. You're leading, but you're not the leader. You're the follower of me. And when you follow me, they'll follow you. And when you do it right, it works right. When you do it right, it works right. Okay, so page 7. Chapter 11. And I want to look at verse 23. So here's the thing. When they did the Jericho thing, and God said, just march around the city, blow the trumpets, did it work? Yeah. In chapter 9, we get a story, in chapter 7 and chapter 9, we get a story that they decide, well, we're going to go and capture this city. We got our own plans, God. Thanks. We got our own plans. And did it work? No. All right. So we got chapter 11, verse 23. The last verse. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord directed Moses, and he gave it to them as an inheritance to Israel, according to their tribal division. And the land was at rest from war. Well, what does that passage suggest happened in verse 11, or the last verse of chapter 23? Mission accomplished. That's not really the truth, though. It's not the way it really was. Look at verse 13, or chapter 13. Got chapter 13? I'm going to look at verse 1. When Joshua was old and well advanced in years, the Lord said to him, you are very old, and there are still very large areas of the land to be taken over. Has the mission been accomplished?
No.
Verse 23. Verse 13, I mean. Oh, but the Israelites did not drive out the people of Yeshua and Machah, so they continue to live among the Israelites to this day. So that partially tells you that this book of Joshua is not being written during his lifetime. It got written later. And that they didn't complete the work of driving out the people because they're still living there to this day of the writing, whenever that was. We don't know when it was written, but whenever it gets written, they're still dealing with this issue. Okay? And all those other verses that I got listed there pretty much say the same thing. Skip over to chapter 23, verse 4 through 8. This is the second to last chapter of the book. Chapters 23, verses 4 to 8. All right. Oh, God speaking. Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations that I conquered, between the Jordan and the great sea in the west. The Lord your God himself will drive them out of your way. He will push them out before you, and you will take possession of the land as the Lord your God promised you. So be strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. So again, it gives the impression that Joshua, near the end of his life, still realizes that there's what? There's still people in the land, and they haven't taken possession of it all. All right. So, just if you look at that third bullet point there on page 7, third little paragraph, chapters 13 through 19 then describe the division of the land among the tribes. Okay? So let's look quick, 14 verse 1. Chapter 14 verse 1. Miss Peg, do you want to read that one, big voice?
Joshua 14:1.
Yes, ma'am.
Now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted to them.
Okay, so each tribal people get an allotment of land, but it was called an inheritance. Okay? That means who's still the owner? God. Still the owner. So what could and would the Lord God do if his people persisted in unrepentant idolatry? You lose the inheritance. You lose the land. You lose the inheritance. It's not theirs. It's God's. It always has been God's. And you lose it if you do not be faithful. Okay, finally, Joshua 24. I made mention to that a bit ago. If you look at chapter 24, we're not going to read the whole chapter. It's a great chapter, though. Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, the leaders, the judges, the officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And then Joshua said to the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." And then he just does the preservation and the rereading of the covenant. And so he reads everything that God has done for them with Moses and the Egyptians and Aaron leading the people, how they entered into the land, how God has led them all the way, and how they've committed themselves to God. And then if we get down to verse 23. Oh, I'm going to 22. 22. Okay. Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourself that you have chosen to serve the Lord." "Yes, we are witnesses," they replied. "Now then," Joshua said, "throw away the foreign gods that are among you." What did they still have in their houses? They still got them. "Throw them away. Yield your hearts to the Lord your God." And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." And on that day Joshua made a covenant for the people, and they recommitted themselves to it. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone, set it up under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. And they recommitted themselves to God. Now, you got to be wondering, how come it says in one verse, there was rest in the land, they took all the land and they possessed it, but it really didn't happen that way? It's not unusual to write history that way. When you studied social studies, American Revolutionary history, early history, what are some stories you remember about George Washington?
Chopping down the tree.
Chopping down the tree. Honest guy. Good worker, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, third president, we know, but when you do dig real deep history of the American Revolution and the American early history of our founding fathers.
Slaves.
Yeah, they had slaves. They weren't great, pure guys. They did bad stuff. But you don't learn that in 4th or 5th grade social studies history, do you? No need to. But there's more to the story, isn't there? Yeah. That's kind of what's happening here. Joshua is the version for Sunday school. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and Judges is going to tell us this is more like it really was, right? It wasn't quite as hunky-dory. Okay? So that's where we get into frame number 8, the story of the Judges. Again, next book of the Bible, Joshua, Judges. This is, again, prophetic book, but it happens over a time span of about 250 to 300 years. And on your little timeline of what number frame 8 draws you to this, and then it names out the 14 different judges that are there. Joshua being the first, Samuel being the last. The story of Samson and Gideon, those are two of the more famous ones that we had that maybe you looked at different times in Sunday school. But these judges are really military leaders. And we're going to break down what this symbol means and how it divides us. So, first of all, the story of Judges is also a conquest narrative. Okay, it's a bit different than Joshua. This is the PhD level, right, of studying American history, not the grade school level. Joshua was the grade school level of studying American history. This is now the PhD level. This is getting behind the scenes and theologically seeing really what's going on with it. Okay? And so the first 2 chapters of Judges can create the impression that though the various tribes tried to capture the land allotted and given to them, they did it individually, tribe by tribe. Okay? And then Joshua says, this is how it should have happened. Judges is saying this is how it really kind of did happen. Make sense? Now, Judges reports what's really going on, and we're going to break down that frame. So that picture is described, or there on page 8. But before we get there, I want to look at a couple Bible passages. So stay with me on page 7, and let's look at chapters 1, verses 27 through 36. Are you there? Judges, yeah. Judges chapter 1, verses 27 is where I'm going to start. Okay. But Manasseh, that's one of the tribes. Manasseh is one of the sons of Joseph. Okay. Joseph gets 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. But Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan, or Tanakh, or Dor, or Ebion, or Megiddo, and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim, another one of the tribes, drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. Neither did Zebulun, that's one of the tribes, drive out the Canaanite kings living in Ketron or Nahal, who remained among them, but they did subject them to forced labor. Nor did Asher, another tribe, drive out those living in Akko or Sidon or Elab, or, I'm not pronouncing any of these right, by the way, Akzib or Heba or Ephach or Rehob. And because these people of Asher lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, neither did Naphtali, another one of the tribes, drive out those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Hanath, but the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, those living in those different places, and they became forced laborers for them. And are you getting the picture? The Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down from the plain. And the Amorites were determined also to hold on to Mount Heres and all those different places. But when the power of the house of Joseph increased, they were too pressed into forced labor. And the boundary of the Amorites from the Scorpion Pass to Selah and beyond. Are you getting the picture? All these tribes are taking possession. This is how the land was divided. These are all the different tribal breakups to it. But yet they're not getting rid of all the people of the land. Okay. Joshua says that it seems like they got rid of them all and was rest. No, not quite. Not really. And what's happening? Why is that going to be a problem? Well, here's what happens. This idol, that little image there, it's a very graphic image. It's obviously a goddess, a female goddess. This is the worship ritual of ancient Canaan. Okay, they had fertility gods. In Egypt, when you farmed, you always had what? The Nile River. You had water. You had irrigation. Now, when you come into this new land, the land of Canaan, irrigation like that's not possible. What do you rely on? Rain, the seasons, right? Now, the fertility religions of the Canaanites was basically this. You had Baal, who was the male god, and you had Ashtoreth, the female goddess. The male god lived in the heavens. Ashtoreth was Mother Earth. By the way, whenever you say Mother Nature, you're calling on a pagan goddess. You don't know that, but you are. So don't say it anymore. Mother Nature is the pagan goddess, Ashtoreth. And the male god is raining his semen down on Mother Earth to fertilize it so the crops grow. That's the fertility religions of the Canaanites. So if you're a Canaanite and you want your local gods to make rain come down, you go to your temple and you engage with sex with a temple prostitute because you want to excite Baal to have sexual intercourse by raining with Ashtoreth. That's the fertility gods. That's the fertility worship of the land. And God says, what kind of part should you take in that?
None.
None. Don't do it. But you come into this new land and you see how it works. This is how you make it rain. God, they walk right into it. It's exactly what they do. God says, don't do it. So what do? They do exactly that. That's why God is against the people of that land, because they have forsaken him. He wants his people to come into that land to be a light, to show them what God's really like. Live your life this way and they're going to want to follow me. They are not willing to do that. They don't keep the promise, right? And so what happens is we've got all these tribal places, and because the people are not doing what God says, well, God's going to let the nations around them have their way on his people. And so you've got these different people groups, these Ammonites, these Midianites, these Amalekites, Canaanites, and Moabites. By the way, these are all related to who? They're all descendants of Abraham as well. Right? The Moabites, they're descendants of Lot and his incestual relationship with his daughters. By the way, Jesus has family ties to all of these families too. Right? These are all, except for the Canaanites, all of these are people groups, and the Philistines. All of these, though, otherwise are people groups that are related to Abraham, through Isaac even. Some of them are related through Ishmael. But they're all same things, right? And so they come and they attack on these tribes, and then God will send a deliverer. So let's take a look at how something like this looked. Chapter 2, verse 6 through 11. Chapter 2, verse 6 through 11. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each of his own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done. So they were faithful, right? That first generation. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at an age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Now, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Seems like they didn't do a very good job of what? Teaching and passing on the faith. Right? Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baals. They served the gods of the land. Therefore, they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to the raiders who plundered them, who sold them to their enemies all around, and who were no longer able to resist. And whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. And there was great distress. Okay. Now, there's a pattern going on here. Okay. If you look at, I got a slide for that. I don't. Okay, so look at the next page. Look at page 8. So here's the pattern of what's happening. I call it the ABCD. ABCD. And if you live in North Carolina, here's what ABCD means. Anybody but Carolina or Duke.
Oh.
That means that you are a fan of the Wolfpack. Go NC State. I was definitely an ABCDer. I hated Carolina Tar Heels and Duke. I shouldn't say hate. I strongly disliked them. I was a big bad guy. Yeah, go with that. ABCD. But that's not what that means here. The passages we just read out, A stands for apostasy. Apostasy. You know what apostasy means? It means rebellion. It starts with an A. So it's a nice way of putting it. So apostasy is rebellion. A rebellion against God. Right? You serve the other gods, the Ashtoreths and the Baals. B is for battered. God allows Israel's neighbors to attack them. The Moabites, they're going to, boom, we're going to hit you. The Canaanites, boom, we're going to hit that tribe. Okay? So God's going to allow his people to be battered. Okay? He said, if you run after other gods and you forsake me and your idolatry, this will happen to you. And it did. They got battered. C stands for, got a guess? Take a look at what the definition behind it. Cry. Confession. Yeah. A cry for help or confession. The people cry out to God for help. They cry out to God for help. That comes in verse 16. So look at verse 16 of chapter 2 again. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of their raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, and they prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's command. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed them and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to the ways even more corrupt than those their fathers, following other gods, serving and worshiping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. So when they would cry out to God, God would, D is for deliverer. God would raise up a charismatic leader. We call them judges, but they were deliverers, raised up by God, sent by God to deliver his people from the enemy that they had at the time. And so you've got these guys by the name of Gideon, right? He's the guy who helps them in the time period of the Midianites. And then Samson, he fights the Philistines, right? And God raises up these charismatic leaders whenever they're needed, when the people have cried out. And as long as that judge lived, the people were faithful. But when that judge died, what happened? They start over. This is a 300-year cycle of A, B, C, D.
We're no different.
We're not.
We don't tend to.
You don't
things
have
to get bad for us before we cry out to God.
Yeah, but
And then he comes.
we don't have fertility goddess or God worship.
We have other things.
Our country is the most sexualized country. Come
Oh,
on.
God.
We sexualize
Everything.
toddlers,
Yeah.
little girls. Yeah, we're not. Yeah, we are. Yeah, we're just a little, not quite as crass. Not quite as crass. So yeah, so this is the cycle. A, B, C, D. Rebellion, apostasy, go against God. God allows them to get battered. That calls them back to God. They cry back to God. And then God delivers them. And this is a cycle over and over and over. 300 years. They're in the land. They've inherited the land, but they haven't been the light. They have not been the light that God called them to be. So, page 8. This story of Judges, this theological history, it's introducing a couple themes. I'm going to read there from the middle of the page. The book of Judges suggests that if the Israelites were to remain in the land, it was essential that they have these three things. A political unity, right? How can 12 independent tribes survive and move forward if they're only interested in their own individual tribal interests, right? So they need to have a political unity if they're going to survive in the land. They need a spiritual purity. The building of shrines in each and every area led people to worshiping the gods, in little quotes, that the people of the land served and worshiped. They practiced idolatry, serving these false gods as being amplified. So they need to have spiritual purity. And then finally, they need a dynastic continuity. They need a king, right? So that's what this symbol is here. the last little image of this image of the judges is this crown with a question mark. They need to have a king like the rest of the lands. They need a ruler over them to lead and guide them, because that's what that's what all these other people have. They have kings that people listen to and follow and serve. And so that's the question that Judges ends with, to have kings, to be or not to have kings. And that leads to a little bit of a problem, because does Israel have a king? Who?
The Lord.
The Lord is their
But he's
king.
not visible, that's
He
the
is
problem.
not.
That's the problem for them.
Right. So that's the question that the story of
Yeah.
Judges is bringing us to. Do we need a king or not? We've got a king, the Lord, but yeah, we need a king like the people around us have a king. So we're not going to read it, but there's the last part of Judges, starting around chapter 17 to the end. There's a line that keeps going. And the people did everything that they saw. I think it's the last verse of Judges. Let's look at that. It's like repeated 6 or 7 times. And there's the last 6 chapters of Judges you don't want to read for enlightenment. The last 4. Judges 17 through 21 include gang rape, dismemberment, multiple murders. It's just awful, awful stuff. And this is why the last verse of Joshua says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. So all those torrid, awful stories that are happening, the conclusion, the biblical writer here, conclusions say, well, this is happening because we have no king. And everybody is doing whatever they think needs to be done. And so that is the final question then of Kings, is do we have a king or not? And that's what 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is going to take us to. But before we do that, I got to ask, do you want to have a break? Or do you want to just have some lunch now? Or do you just want to do a short little break, press on and do a little bit more, and then have lunch? Doesn't matter? Okay, let's take just a couple minute break for a restroom, get a little drink, and then we'll come back. And I want to do the king story first, and then we'll have some lunch. Does that sound all right? Okay, if anybody needs a soda, sodas are down in the refrigerator in the fellowship hall. And if you want water, there's some waters right in here. And sodas are in the refrigerator downstairs. Okay. 5 minutes, let's make it quick. We're still going to start in 5.
Yeah. I never paid anything because I kind of.
Just throw it on my desk.
How much is it supposed to be?
10.
No, for you it's a special point.
Yes, exactly.
The late fee.
The late fee. Thank you, buddy.
Yeah.
And we'll send a donation to the Bible Project, guys.
Don will be back in a few.
Okay. It's getting warm in here.
Yeah. I was more of a situation
Turn that heat on. I'll open the window too. Is that okay?
Yeah. Why don't you
Supposed to
open
go
one
30s
though
today.
to the up there? Yeah.
I don't want to bring it.
Because I think it'll be cold on it.
Wow,
It'll be.
that would just be Barb. Who cares?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, she'll love that. Mm-hmm.
She's a psycher girl. She's tough.
She'll make it. Oh. I just gotta get up, sit down.
We're not used to having so many people in here on Sunday after Saturday.
Oh, yeah.
or sometimes an 11,
Okay.
depending on which brand it is.
Would you be interested in some boots or anything, or?
These are actually my work boots.
Yeah.
This is what I wear.
Yeah, but I mean, he's got, there's some, that tie, and I don't know if there's any steel toe or not, but they always had to get them for work, cold storage. And so, he always had to get them, and if you didn't get them, even if you didn't need them, then the next time they wouldn't, or you wouldn't be able to get any, because, well, you don't need them now, you don't need them.
So then you can take them
They
whether
can
you
take
need them or
whether
not.
you need them or not.
So you have lots of shoes.
So he's got boots and stuff that he never even wore, or wore out. Would you be
I
interested?
could see it too.
And if they fit,
because they're probably, I would guess, size 12 or 13.
Yeah, these have
But they're-
maybe 12s.
Yeah, okay. But, I mean, if they fit, if you look. Because right now I said, okay, Dad, because when we moved, I have all these boxes, and they're like lacrosse and, you know, they're pretty decent brand. All these new boxes, so they're underneath the bed. That's his boot shoe storage is under the bed, and I know there's some brand new.
I'd say Paul, but I think his feet are 14 or 15.
Yeah, I don't know.
He's got larger feet.
What size shoes?
15, 16.
Yeah.
Okay, I was
see,
right.
Yep. Because I was telling him, John had some work boots, and he had to get them, whether he really needed them or not, if they had that process. So he's got some brand new ones he never wore, and there's no way he can wear them out.
My boys,
Yeah, if you can, if your boys wear them, that would be good.
they cost them, or Logan's like a 13. so
Yeah, they're 12 or 13.
It probably depends on how they run.
But it's, yeah,
Cross is always
they're
pretty
the cross, and yeah, they're a good boot. And,
If you think the boys can use them.
No.
We'll bring them sometime
Yeah.
if they'd be interested, but I don't, Don didn't think they were steel toed. I don't know, I'd have to
See
look.
the work I have to do.
Yeah, but, and some of them maybe, and some of them not, but I'll take his,
So when it
his
comes
son
time
had
for
boxes
lunch,
and boxes
What?
of brand new shoes. They're under the
if
bed
you-
now.
you would help
They fit, the
pushing
boxes
stuff
just
out
fit.
and stuff like that.
Sure. Storage.
Is it all in the fridge downstairs?
Yeah, there and the salad's still in the bags. I didn't want to dump it out
Okay.
and get it. I wanted to wait for the last second.
Sure.
That kind of stuff. That's the main.
Yep.
I'm gonna recruit a couple of them. I should go stir my soup.
Okay.
All right, I gotta go stir my soup.
We'll start when I come back.
Sundrop. How much sugar's in that?
I need a caffeine hit.
Coffee doesn't have any sugar in it. Unless you put it there.
Unless you put it in.
It's good.
These are not comfortable chairs. They're made for sitting in for about an hour, and after that,
Not so much.
I don't know, chair.
Yeah, you bring your first weight in when you're in the hospital and stuff all the time. You got a cordless electric blanket.
Oh my gosh, it's rechargeable?
Yeah, it takes a little power source.
Awesome.
It only heats a spot that big, but a warm spot like that with a little
Warm up your
blanket.
whole body then, yeah. Didn't know they made-
I didn't either, but she saw it, she goes, I think we should have it for all of us.
Yeah.
We have used it, so I have used it.
That'd even be good for deer hunting or Packer games or lots of things.
Lots of things.
Work, yeah.
I have a heated vest.
At my office upstairs,
But I don't wear that when we go to the
the
clinic.
heat never stopped.
Oh,
I got a, most people's were, they were like, Sarah Binders and mine. So we put a thermometer in, it'd be like 76 in summer. I always had a fan blowing right on me.
Mine was 68, but this was controlled by the office next to me, which was set at 72. Mine never got warm, and then it fixed it finally the really cold day. And so mine went good, and then Robin's all of a sudden went down to 66 was the highest they got.
And it's brand new.
Great, so
Oh
something's,
my
yeah.
gosh.
And it's not, you know, we said our house is 68, but we're moving, you know.
Right,
You're sitting.
right, you're not sitting still.
Before they get around to 80.
Yeah, his mom's house at Christmas, you
Yeah.
don't dare wear long sleeves.
I turned my fireplace up to get to 80, then I turned it off and
keeps it warm for a while.
Anything eat, that is not too bad.
Probably got behind us before, didn't she?
Huh?
Oh, yeah, she's pretty little. And so.
I'm with James.
What's that?
I'm with James.
Oh, you're cold?
No.
But
I don't
I'd
like
rather
being
be cold than hot.
All right, everybody. Oh, that feels good. Open this one too. Will that be okay? Will that offend you? Too cold?
It is chilly, I mean, just sitting next to me is cool.
I'm just gonna keep this one open. Is that okay? It's like 77 in there. Doesn't that say 77?
Yeah.
I don't
I don't
believe
think
it.
it's 77.
I don't know.
You're warm?
Yeah.
He said that's that.
I'm working. All
Yeah,
right.
he is.
So page, so we're on page 9, and we're going to transition from frame number 8 to frame number 9. All right, and my clicker, there it is. So when we finish Judges, we are getting this theme, right? There was no king in the land, so everybody did as they saw fit. All right. So this is now the story of the kings. Goes from Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. All those books, again, Jesus would have considered them as the prophets. Okay, those are the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, they're prophets too. But these are prophets. And their history, though, they're in our English Bibles, we often call them the historical books. That's fine, that's accurate. But they're theological history, again. So they're not telling us every single aspect of history. They're telling us the history through the lens of a theological prophet. What's going on in the storyline? And what's the storyline again? A world that got broken by sin, and God doing what? Bringing it back through grace. And he chooses to do it through who?
Jesus.
Well, not just, doesn't start with Jesus, it gets to Jesus. Through Abraham and his descendants, right? The covenant to Abraham. So I'm going to write that up here. The Abraham covenant. I'm just going to do Abe. We all know what that means. Genesis 12 and 15, and then repeat it. And it is land, offspring, and what was the last one? Blessing. This is the purpose. Blessing for the nations. Who are the nations?
All of us.
All of us. Everybody outside of the Abraham ethnic line. We are, and this is an unconditional. Oops. Unconditional. Which again, Bobby, means? No strings attached. All dependent on God's faithfulness. We had another covenant that we talked about, the Moses covenant. That was in Exodus, right? Exodus 19 through Deuteronomy 20 or 30. The Moses covenant, and that was conditional. You don't get saved by doing it. It's just a way that God says he wants us to live under him. Okay? So this is the faithful God. I'm going to keep this promise no matter what you do. I'm going to keep this promise. Except for this one, because if you follow, you lose the land. You're cut off from it. But the rest of it I'm going to keep. This is conditional. Right? God doesn't mean that we're saved because we do things right. This is just, I want you to be kings and priests in this world, that people will get to see me, what I'm really like, by the way you live. And if you fail at it, there'll be consequences, and there were. Okay. Oh, I didn't. Thank you. Oh, I never stopped it. So we recorded our break. So sorry about that. If you're watching, fast forward. I hope you fast forward. Paul, would you remind me when we have lunch that we're doing? That we should stop the recording. Yeah. Matt will kind of go wonder, what the heck? All right. So now I lost my train of thought. But that's what, no, don't be sorry. You did the right thing by asking. So we're going to come now to the story of Kings. Because now we're going to get another big covenant. That's the point of the story. We're going to get another big covenant. All right? So, for top of page 9, 2 Samuel, we're going to spend a little time on. There we call it the David covenant. So we got stories of the kings. So let's go to 1 Samuel. It's the story right after Judges. Well, you got Ruth, and then there's Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 8. All right. Miss Peggy, I'm going to ask you to read verses 1 through 10, please. Big voice.
When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside from after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel in Ramah, and they said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all of that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do."
And verse 10.
Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king.
Okay, that's right.
Okay.
So what's the crisis? How would you summarize the crisis that has arisen now amongst the people?
Oh, they're being complainers again.
Complainers.
They need a king.
They need a king.
They need something visible.
Joshua is a judge. He's a deliverer. I mean, not Joshua. Samuel is a judge and deliverer. But his sons who should take over are what?
Corrupt.
They're bad. They're bad news. They're corrupt.
Oh, but it sounds like they are too, the people.
Yeah, but they don't have a good leader.
Yeah.
They need a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
And the boys are not up to it,
Yeah.
right? And so they want to have a king. Okay? And Samuel's concerned, you're going to make God feel bad. We're going to reject God as our king. And God's reply was, I get it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. I get it. But they're going to give them a king anyway. They need to have this image of a dynastic continuity to feel safe and secure. So God is condescending, if you will, to the needs of the people. And he's going to accommodate the needs of his people. Okay? So he's going to say, you get to have a king. So that's where we get introduced to the first king. If you want to read chapter 9, and we're going to read just verse 1 and 2. And then we're going to skip down to verse 15 through 17. So, Peg, you want to read verse 1 and 2 again?
There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, and the son of Zeror, and son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiad, of Benjamin. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others.
Okay, so far we know something about this Saul. What are a few things we know about Saul?
He's a big guy.
Big up, head taller, impressive young man,
Yeah.
right? Strapping, young, tall, the kind of dude you want to follow, right? And he's from what tribe?
Benjamite.
Tribe of Benjamin. He's a Benjamin tribe guy, okay? All right.
23,
And now we skip down to verse 15.
15. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. About this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him leader over my people Israel, and he will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. And I have looked upon my people, for their cry has reached me.
Okay, so they've got these tribal people that are living amongst them and around them. This time it's the Philistines. By the way, this area of land is called what? You know that today?
Is that the Gaza Strip?
This is the Gaza Strip. Right? This is the land of the Philistines. And they've been oppressing the people. And they need a deliverer. And God says, I'm done with the deliverers. They want a king. We're going to give them a king because I want my people to know my presence among them. And so Saul gets anointed. And he's going to help take care of this crisis at the moment. Okay? And Saul doesn't know it, but he's going to be anointed. And it says in verse 16, anoint him as what? Leader. Okay? So here's an interesting thing about that. There's two words that are going to be making plays throughout this reading. And one is called leader, and the other one is king. Okay? This is the Hebrew word nagid. Nagid. And it means, sometimes it gets translated as prince or leader. If you're a prince, what does that imply?
Royalty.
Royalty, but are you the guy?
No, there's a king.
There's a king. And so the Hebrew word for king is melech. God wants his princes that are getting anointed to be considered leaders and princes, because who's the real king?
He is.
He is still going to be king. Okay? What's going to happen is sometimes these guys think they're not the Nagid anymore, but they're the
Melech.
They're the melech. Right? They're the melech. And that'll be the problem. This is why Samuel, by the way, is worried. Because he knows the inclination of men. They're going to try to be melechs, God. God says, I know, but let's give them kings anyway. Because there's a covenant coming with this, okay? And when Samuel warns the people, by the way, he goes, I get you want to have a king, but do you know what it means to have a king? To have a king means your government's going to be centralized. They're going to tax the heck out of you in order to support their government. And they're going to take your boys to be there in their armies. And you're going to have to do everything you do to support them. And the people go, fine, we want it. And so God chooses, says, here's the guy. He's a head taller than everybody else. There's your king. There's your leader, your prince, your Nagid. All right. Now, after Saul gets rejected, we're not going to do that whole story, but Saul does get rejected because Saul tries to do things on his own as the king. He does the sacrifices instead of waiting for the priests and Samuel and stuff like that. So he gets rejected by God. So let's look at 1 Samuel 13. God says Saul's not the guy. Thought he would have been guy, but he missteps. He doesn't follow in my ways. Okay? So we got chapter 13, verse 13. God's going to go to another plan. You want to read that one again, Peggy? 13 to 14.
You acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command.
All right. So God says to Samuel, Samuel tells to Saul, God's got another guy in mind, a man after his own heart. Okay. So chapter 16. Skip over to chapter 16 and verse 10.
Over to 16.
Yeah, chapter 16. Verse 10. So God eventually tells Samuel to go to the village of Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and Jesse's got a bunch of sons there. And one of them God has in mind. So chapter 16, verse 10.
Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? Well, they're still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he is tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. He is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah.
All right. So now we got a little bit of a problem here. What's the problem that you would see?
Oh, jealousy.
Jealousy. Well, yeah, not so much between the brothers.
No?
No. Saul is what?
King.
And now David has been anointed.
Oh, he's still king.
Saul is still king,
Okay.
and David's been anointed. So now there are 2 anointed kings, and they're from 2 different tribes.
Yeah.
One is from Benjamin, one is from the tribe of Judah. 2 different tribes, 2 different kings, both anointed by God. One recognized by all the tribes, being Saul. Right now, who's the only ones that know that David's been anointed? Samuel and his family. That's it. And David has been already in league working for Saul, right? But now he's the chosen one and anointed one, and Saul's been rejected. You think Saul wants to give up? No. So
That would be too easy.
we have got chapters, for the rest of the story of 1 Samuel is all dealing with this tension between Saul and David. And how will that work out? How will it work out? It's pretty violent. There's a lot of backstabbing to it. It's not a pretty picture. But eventually Saul dies. He dies in battle. He got so bad that he practiced necromancy, which is talking to the dead. So he invoked the magical dark arts and wanted to know the future, and invoked the witch of Endor, who communicated with the dead, Samuel. That's how bad he got, Saul, and he perishes. But now you've got how many tribes? 12, and they've been loyal to the tribe of Benjamin and Saul. Now you got David coming alongside, and nobody liked. What was a civil war? It was a 7-year civil war that went on, and like I said, it's pretty brutal. And then we get to
the civil war is
between the tribes and the two tribes, between those who were loyal to Saul and those who were loyal to David.
even though Saul's dead.
Even though Saul's dead.
Okay.
He's got family, doesn't he?
Okay.
Jonathan is his son, who is, by the way, whose best friend?
David's.
David's best friend.
Oh.
Yeah. And Jonathan's willing to step aside and let David, but
The people won't
people
accept
don't.
that.
The guys who were in the power of
And is
Saul
David
don't want
fairly
to give up.
young? And
David's been
that's-
fairly young, and David's not an upright guy, by the way. David basically runs a mafia business at one point. So David, there's the story of David comes to a village area, and he goes, there's some bad guys around here, and I'll protect you if you pay me. Well, who are the bad guys? David points. See the guys behind me? I'm going to protect you from me. So if you pay. And if you don't pay, we do stuff to you. And so he was pretty brutal to those people who didn't pay. In fact, he wiped out one whole village so there would be no evidence of it. And then he escapes at one point down to, guess where? The Gaza Strip. He goes down to the land of the Philistines, acts like a crazy man. And the king, the crazy, says, hey, this guy's crazy, get him out of here. And he goes, and so when David actually does subdue all the land, he never takes that as his own. He subjugates, he overtakes it, but he never possesses it. Which is why today, when in 1944, when Golda Meir and the Zionist armies retook the land, they forced all the people of that land, millions of them, to live in a small little strip of land called the Gaza Strip, because it was never part of the David kingdom. And so they say no claim of it. But they forced 5 million people to live in this little strip of land. Before the whole war broke out in October 7th, the United Nations rightly declared it as the worst place in the world to live. It's a living hell. It was a living hell. The Israelite, the Jewish government basically had a quota of how many calories they would let people eat. They were starving them. And they would reduce the water, eliminate the water supplies for them. I mean, it's a lot more complicated.
Because the
than our
sea
news
is
talks
salt
about.
water, it's not.
Well, yeah.
Right?
Right.
Pastor?
Yes, sir. I don't want to get off in this soapbox too long.
Okay, the tribe of Benjamin, those two, there were two tribes that came from Jacob's wife, Rebecca, right?
Yeah,
Leah. So Benjamin was one, right?
No.
No?
The 12 tribes were the ones who get land are everybody, but the Levites get no land, right? They don't inherit land, the Levites, and so Joseph gets the last two tribal 12 become from Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. Those are Joseph's sons.
Was his wife Egyptian woman?
Yeah, they are the ones who become the land. Yep. So there's 12 tribes. Benjamin was Rachel and Joseph. They were Rachel's sons. Yeah, but Judah was not. Judah was the son of one of the first wives. I think the wife of Leah. He was the son of Leah. Okay. All right. So we got one more thing to do here. 2 Samuel chapter 5. So skip over to 2 Samuel chapter 5. So David has the claim of kingship because he's been anointed, but the tribes really don't want anything to do with him at first because he's from Judah, and we had Benjamin, and Benjamin's they want to remain in the power, and all the people behind them want to remain, because when you have the king, what kind of life do you live? A little easier life than the rest of the people. So you want to keep that power. So the transition of power, a peaceful transition of power that our nation knows, it's incredibly. I mean, it's just having been to parts in the world, Uganda, that has never known that, they were amazed. I was there, my first trip, I was there when President Obama was inaugurated. My flight back was the day after. And the people of Uganda they were dumbfounded. How would you have a Kenyan? They called him a Kenyan because that was his family's origin. He was an American citizen, but a black man, a Kenyan. And you let him be the president? How does President Bush step aside? That's our history. And that's why you're the greatest nation in the world. I said, yeah, we have our problems. You are the greatest. And because they just saw that as an amazing thing, because they've never known that. They're tribal infighting, and then the people who have the power.
Every change of power was basically an insurrection.
Terrifying thing. So they've got a president who's been president for 35 years, Museveni, who wins every election. The old guard says, we're fine with that. He brings sanity. The younger people who've never known the time of Idi Amin, they're like, no, it's corrupt. And the old people go, no, it's okay. It's
Believe
okay.
us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to get off on that soapbox anymore either. So let's get back to 2 Samuel. All right. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. This is after the 7-year civil war. We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns, and the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler, their Nagid. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them. At Hebron before the Lord, they anointed King David over Israel. So now finally, he unites all 12 tribes under him. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over Israel and Judah for 33 years. Jerusalem the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off, they thought. David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion. And now notice what the writer says, the city of David. Keep that in your mind. Jerusalem is the city of David, according to this book.
Why do they say the fortress of Zion?
This is just another word for it.
Okay.
It's a fortified city, and Zion was the name of it, on the top of the hill. Okay. On that day, David said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and the lame will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in a fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the supporting terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. All right, so this is David establishing, in a brilliant move, by the way, Jerusalem as his capital city. My map doesn't show it here very well. I'm going to go back to this one real quick. So this is the tribe of Benjamin right here, this yellow dot. Okay, it's just north. This is the tribe of Judah's land. Here's the Dead Sea. Jerusalem was right there on the border of Judah and Benjamin. And it was a fortified city. And who was living there? It said the Jebusites, which means it had not become an Israelite city. And it became this fortified city that, so it's kind of like David going, how do I unite these 12 tribes who are really, really hard to govern and rule over? I need one place. If I take my home city of Hebron, which he did for 7 years, everybody's going to think you're showing favorites to your own people. So he looks for a city-state that has never been conquered. And that he conquers, and that he makes his capital. Our forefathers knew that in our country as well. What did they do to establish a national capital?
Put it in Jerusalem.
No, our country.
Oh, in our country.
Washington, Philadelphia, New York City. I don't know.
Not a-
Washington,
not a
D.C.
state.
Not in a state. It became its own independent district. Not a state on purpose. So that there's no favoritism to Maryland or to Philadelphia or to New York. Right? It was done on purpose. Very wisely done. David already did that same pattern right there. Okay? So David is pretty brilliant and pretty shrewd. All right? So the first king is Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay? The second king is David from the tribe of Judah, who establishes now a united kingdom. Okay? Now, there's a fierce struggle going to go on to take place of who succeeds David. Before we get to that, we got to talk about why is that an important thing. So, we got one more question here. Page 9. In the Old Testament, Jerusalem's known as the city of David, right? He calls it the city of David. The New Testament, what becomes recognized as the city of David? Bethlehem. For unto you is born this day in the city of David. And where was that? That's Bethlehem.
So was that his birthplace?
That was his birthplace. And it's a small little village like Metz. Right? Who says I'm from Metz these days? Not many people. From Fremont, but nobody knows where Metz is. A lot of people don't even know where Fremont is. Metz. Right? That's Bethlehem. Right? And that becomes the city of David, not Jerusalem. What does that mean? Jerusalem is rejected. God isn't worried in the power places of the world. God will use the ordinary to do the extraordinary. And that's what God's doing here. And now 2 Samuel. This is another major moment in the Bible. So we're going to spend just a little bit more time in it. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now after the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord God had given him rest from his enemies around him, David said to Nathan the prophet, here I am living in a palace of cedar while the ark of God remains in a tent. Right? God's still living in a tent, a tabernacle. Nathan replied to the king, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord's with you. So David wants to build him a house. I got to build God a house, a temple. He needs it. That night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, go tell my servant, this is what the Lord says. Are you going to build a house for me to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. So God says, I don't want a house. A tent is fine with me. Which means if you're an RV camper, you're not biblical. God only wants tent campers, not RV campers. Maybe that's too far?
Yeah.
Okay, too far. Verse 7, wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers who I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why haven't you built me a house of cedar? Now then tell my servant David, this is what the Lord God Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from following the flock, to be a Nagid, a ruler, a prince, over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have cut you off from all the enemies from before you, and now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide for you a place for my people Israel, where I will plant them, so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since I've appointed leaders, Nagids, over my people Israel. I will give you also rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. Now God's doing a wordplay here, right? A house doesn't mean a literal building anymore. What does it mean now?
The people.
A lineage of kings. A house means the house of David. Somebody from his family line will be a king, a dynastic continuity. Okay? So I will establish for you a house. And when your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom, a house, a dynasty of kings. And he is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, and I will be his father, and he will be my son. Did you hear that? I will be his father, and he will be my son. And he will be the king. Right? And when he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with the floggings inflicted by men. Oh, but my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever.
So is this the new covenant?
No.
No.
This is well, it is a covenant. It's not the new covenant. It's just another covenant. This is the Davidic covenant. Okay? So this is the unconditional one. This is also now an unconditional one. The Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel 7. And God's promise is there will be a king from David's line who rules how long?
Forever.
Forever. And will be a perfect king, ruling over his people forever. Unconditional. God's going to fulfill this promise despite the kings who screw it up. Okay?
And it's a king, not a leader, not a Najib.
It's a Nagid. It'll be a Nagid. It'll be a Nagid, right? Now, we're going to see this lasted, the kings of David lasted for about 400 years until they finally were overthrown. But does this get fulfilled? Well, Luke chapter 1, verse 36, an angel visits a young woman in Nazareth from the house of David, betrothed to a man from the house of David, and says, blessed are you. Do not be afraid. You're going to bear a son. And God's going to give him the kingdom of David. And he will rule forever. Angel Gabriel promises to Mary that her son will be the one who rules over God's people forever. From which line? So when our prophets come along, they're going to attack people and accuse people and their failures of not fulfilling this covenant. But they're going to say, God's going to be faithful, and don't worry, God's got promises for you based on this covenant and this covenant, which does not depend on the people or their faithfulness. In fact, they're unfaithful.
It says I will be to him a father and he to me a son. When he commits iniquity, is he still talking about?
You're not talking about Jesus anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. But he's ultimately, it'll be fulfilled in Jesus. But yeah. And now here's the thing. Who else are kings and queens in this kingdom? We are. We are the kings and queens of this kingdom as well. We're a kingdom of priests. We are a royal people. God says we're a royal people. We're the kings and queens. Not the Melech. That's just the Lord. Jesus will assume that. But we're these. Okay. So remember that covenant. We're going to come back. We'll come back to it again. Okay. So I got to do a couple more things on this slide. Now we got a problem. David has how many wives? Do you know? Way too many. He's not a very good father. You know, he's not. He's just a bad father. Just flat out bad father. So he's got 4 sons. Oops, I missed one slide. So that's why we've got this. Oh, by the way, this is our Ark of the Covenant, and what is that little star there? Star of David. So David establishes Jerusalem as the city of David, his political capital, and he moves the shrine and becomes the religious capital as well, right? And the Ark of the Covenant resides there. And then this is just expanding. So David, these are the tribal areas that the people inherited. Well, David subjugates the entire area, and he expands his kingdom farther. And this is, by the way, why this land is still being contested. Because the Israelites say, well, no, this should be our land here, the Golan Heights. That was never part of the original Davidic place. Down here, that was never part of the original. And so they're just trying to repopulate. But not this land, because that was where the Philistines were. David never took that land. Now we got these 4 crowns, right? These 4 crowns. What's going on with that? So David has a bunch of sons. Always the oldest son becomes the king, right? Well, the oldest son is a guy by the name of Amon. And Amon, he rapes his half-sister. Yeah? And guess what daddy does? Nothing. No discipline. So her full brother, a guy by the name of Absalom, says, my daddy didn't take care of Amon when he should have. And you know what Absalom does? He invites him to a party and a feast and he kills him. I'm taking it into my own hands. But then he has to run away because he just killed, but he got rid of the competition too by doing it, right? So Absalom runs away. Well, then what happens is David's getting a little older. People think he's losing a step. And so they say, doesn't he got a son, Absalom, who's kind of in exile? Let's bring him back. And he should be the next king. And so he comes back, and Absalom can't wait, so Absalom leads a revolution, but ultimately loses, right? And his uncle in battle kills him. Okay? So now David's lost 2 sons because he's a bad father. And now he's got a next son is Adonijah. And Adonijah sees dad's getting old. Dad's, they didn't have Viagra in his day. And when a king no longer could fulfill that, they lost their kingships. And so they tried to, they put the prettiest girl in the land laying in bed naked, and David can't do anything. And so Adonijah takes that as a sign as daddy's lost it, he can't be king anymore, and he claims, I'll become king before daddy is dead. Well, Nathan, the prophet, and David's wife Bathsheba, one of his wives, said, we thought you promised, not to Adonijah, but you promised the king would be Solomon, my son. And they convinced David of that. And David says, yeah, you're right. He's a little senile at this point. Yeah, Solomon's going to be the king. And so Adonijah usurped himself, and then he gets in trouble. So now Solomon becomes king when David dies. And David's deathbed wishes, by the way, would you kill off all my past enemies? And basically, that's it. That's his deathbed wish. All right. And Adonijah is still alive, though. And Solomon says, I can't really trust this guy. And so Solomon does what? He has Adonijah executed. So Solomon takes over as king. Okay. So that whole story mess. But God does make the promise, right? David, from your family will come a king over my people for how long? And I will be his father, and he will be my son. And God's going to help his people and rule his people. And now is a good time to break.
Real quick question.
Yes, sir.
With that star being on there,
yep.
Why is the thing on the hunt to find? Do you think it would have stayed its own original land?
I'm sorry, I'm not following.
The Ark of the Covenant?
Oh, the Ark of the Covenant.
It's lost, right?
Well, haven't you seen the Raiders of the Lost Ark?
They found it.
Indiana Jones found it, and it's hidden in the archives of our shows.
Well, that was my brother. He never told me that.
No. It got destroyed. History would probably say it got destroyed when the conquest of Jerusalem happened in 586 BC. I think it got destroyed. Now, you can't make a movie, it got destroyed. Now, but there is a theory that it's still in existence, that it escaped from the temple during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. They got it out of the city of Jerusalem, and they took it to Ethiopia. And there is a tradition that it's being guarded by Coptic monks in some shrine in Ethiopia.
That's new one they built.
That, nobody has seen it, and
It's not proven.
it's basically, it was basically folklore that was propagated for the kings and queens of Ethiopia to maintain their power in the ancient world.
There is a thing in the Bible, they always took the ark into battle.
They did.
And it was falling on the Levites' hands, and 2 soldiers touched it to help steady, and they were instantly killed. So the presence of the Lord was with them.
Yep, the Lord is with it. Which is,
That's
of course,
why they carried it into battle.
and that's why the Nazis wanted it in the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
And Indiana Jones was wise enough to know that when you open it, you better close your eyes because you can't see the face of God, otherwise you're going to be melted. And that's what happened to those bad Nazis. And Indiana Jones didn't because he closed his eyes. So. You don't really believe that story? I think it's there. I think it's there. All right, so we're going to break for lunch. It takes a couple of minutes to get it ready, so head on downstairs, find a spot. Oh, thank you. We're going to pause.